Hey guys, welcome back to Total Tactics FPL. Today's video is going to be the Game Week 27 cheat sheet. And we'll be deep diving into this double game week where, of course, the priority is to go into these Brighton assets and these Brentford assets, and potentially your transfers may be as simple as that. But I understand still some people are actually looking at wildcards, so it's worth talking about the entire landscape of FPL. But of course, we start off with the budget midfielders with McAllister rising towards the top. And that's simply because I really can't pick between Mitoma, March, and McAllister. I actually chose Mitoma and McAllister on my wild card because I wanted to gamble on the upside of McAllister, who's on penalty. So that kind of gives you a little bit of security there if that ever happens, because he has a lot of fixtures over the next few weeks, and ultimately penalties will come in extremely handy in these sort of double game weeks. And on top of that, as we said when we were looking at the underlying statistics, he's the one who had the most potential to be a good asset because of his change of positioning. And all it really takes is for you to have confidence in his ability to accommodate to that position. Because similar to March, which we saw March move from right wing back position, which he traditionally played under Potter, and then moved into the sort of right wing position with De Zerbi. And of course, his numbers have flown up. And we've also seen him do a little bit better when it comes to how clinical he is compared to his underlying stats, because historically a lot of people have pointed out on Twitter and other social platforms that he is a historic underperformer of XG, but I feel like that's also very disingenuous, right? Ultimately, when you're playing right wing back, I don't think your goals and assist tally is what you should be relied upon, and that's why March and his change in positioning is so crucial. I think also people who are saying that March doesn't pass the eye test is ridiculous. You could just look at a game like the Liverpool game as an example of how good he can be as a player, and he was still very illustrative in the West Ham game, even though he got nothing on it. And so, as I say, I think these three assets are fantastic. If you pick 2 out of 3 of them, perfect. If you want to back, of course, the sort of gambling odds, Mitoma seems to be the preferred option based on any betting house. McAllister, however, his numbers have slowly risen, and potentially there's a bit more upside there. Whereas with March, there's actually been a lot of consistency since De Zerbi has joined the team, and his numbers have actually been the best out of all 3 players so far. But what you make of that is up to you. I still think Mitoma has a little bit of flair for me, and that was actually my justification for adding him into my team, despite having worse numbers than March. As far as Almiron, though, he does join the cheat sheet as well. What he does struggle with is simply how this midfield position has almost been locked down. If you look at the sort of green assets that we have here, and of course Salah's not even included, you might consider Salah as a green asset. I personally wouldn't, because I feel like his fixture run is incredibly tough, and he's also got a blank. Whereas, for example, if you look at the Brighton assets who are in a similar situation, at least they have 4 games in 3 game weeks. And then with Rashford as an example, I mean, he's just way too good value. Going to be probably your captain on game week 29 if you do so choose, and still is in electric form, just scored versus Betis as well. And that's simply the lay of the land. Fernandes and Salah is going to be one of those additional options that you want to think about if you're wildcard in game week 27. As far as the 6.0 to 6.9 tier, I've got Barnes here who remains at the same place. I just feel like he just doesn't have the ceiling that you want in an FPL asset. And if you're ever going to spend that sort of money, it has to go towards Maddison. My opinions on Martinelli and Ward-Prowse are exactly the same. Odegaard, we've talked about. Rashford, we've talked about just now. Odegaard, we've talked about previously. But the reason why he drops is just less fixtures. And of course, he still has a tough fixture versus Liverpool in game week 30. And that's where the Arsenal fixtures do start to dove off. I would actually say that Maddison just looks like a little bit more of an interesting short-term transfer than Odegaard, even though he's got worse fixtures. The positive, of course, is he gets to play Chelsea at home, even though Chelsea have moved into what seems like a very solid back 3 structure. However, you still have Maddison with an additional fixture compared to someone like Odegaard in Gaming 29, and he's fantastic for Gaming 30. So I feel like Maddison hits the short term well, just because he has the additional fixture, and then also medium term, he's going to pan out potentially a little bit better than Odegaard, especially now that you probably have Saka in your team and you're going to keep him. Gakpo stays at exactly where he is. I just feel like with Firmino on the outs of the team, Gakpo's going to play a lot of consistent minutes. Yes, maybe he'll be rotated if for whatever magical reason that they actually manage to stay within the Champions League. But there's a high likelihood, right, where Liverpool don't have to rotate too much if they get knocked out by Real Madrid, and their focus will then be on securing that top 4 space and actually being in that fight, because that's where they find themselves within the league. So Gakpo becomes an interesting option. Showed extremely clinical finishing within the Liverpool versus Man United game, but not only that, he's shown the ability to actually hold up the ball well and actually be a creative and assistive asset as well as of late. I feel like the Newcastle game is a good example of that. although of course that was 10 versus 11, but we've already seen good enough glimpses from Gakpo, and the underlying numbers are there. He is very close to both Salah and Darwin at this point in time when we look at the last few fixtures, not exactly the whole season. As far as Saka and Maddison, I've talked about them many times. I feel like Saka is just the asset, or the Arsenal asset, that you want to keep in your team now that the midfield is so congested. You can see that there's effectively 5 green assets here, not even including the premium midfielders. So you're going to have to make a decision with one of these players to drop. And potentially, if you're in a position where you already own Odegaard and you're not wildcarding, then he makes sense as a keep. However, you do want to move out of these green and red assets, some assets that might not even feature on this list, and simply just move towards the key essential options. And for this week, it's going to be those Brighton ones, despite how cheap they are. Salah, Fernandes, Sterling. I'm just not really ready to move on Sterling. He has great underlying numbers, but I feel like you're going to get more bang for your buck from Havertz now that they're playing a 3-4-3 structure. His minutes aren't high enough for what I would say his cost is, compared to someone like a Fernandes and a Salah, where you get the X-Men security. Salah has the penalties, and Fernandes, of course, his creative stats have been sky high. So when we talk about the ceiling of players like Odegaard and KDB on a good day where they get to be super creative, you can see the Leicester game where Man United won as a good example of what can be done from this United team when they have a great haul. And Rashford actually had a brace in that game, but Fernandes took over on bonus points simply because of how illustrative he is on the creative end. We move towards the forwards now. This is a position where I feel like we have too many options and you're actually going to have to make some decisions. You might disagree with whether actually Mbeumo, Ferguson, or Iheanacho are going to be green options whatsoever, and you might actually prefer to spend the money in your team on the more expensive options that are a little bit more tried and trusted. I feel like there are gambles with Mbeumo, Ferguson, and Iheanacho, but all of them are worth looking into, in the sense that if you're going to build a 3-4-3 structure, why not take a punt on one of these players, because they have a lot of fixtures between them, have really good stats in the case of Iheanacho, and you might be able to find a structure that you prefer that targets game weeks 27 to 29, that sort of trajectory well, and they could pan out to be good bets for the rest of the season. For example, Ferguson is someone that I expect to continually start games even though his minutes aren't particularly high, and with Iheanacho we've seen clearly that Brendan Rodgers backs him. At this stage of the season, there aren't many replacement options that can actually take his place from the team. He's looked the most clinical, even after Vardy has come on for several games, and Daka doesn't really look like an option at this point in time. So Iheanacho looks interesting because he actually has the best underlying stats out of any players, irrespective of whether you actually divide that by 90 minutes. Because, of course, we know that Iheanacho, the only threat for him is what happens if Brendan Rodgers decides to start Daka in a game, decides to start Vardy in a game. What that changes for Iheanacho is, of course, much less minutes and much less expected value from him. However, I still think he's a great gamble to go for if you're tempted. Ferguson is so interesting because he's so cheap. And he also, now that Sanchez is no longer an option and potentially you think that there's some threats around Steele, could be the way you go about triple Brighton, because you could be moving into a structure where for all these weeks in the future where we have these double game weeks for Brighton, you have these really cheap options to call upon, and it doesn't really impinge upon your team structure overall, especially after you play the bench boost. So Ferguson seems quite interesting from that point of view, and it seems like his minutes are intact because we know Welbeck can't really play consistently. He's at an age where he's just not going to get many minutes. He's good as a substitute, but Ferguson will most likely start all the games. As far as Mbeumo, he's interesting because we know he's historically a very unclinical finisher. He had lots of great underlying stats in the previous season and really failed to deliver. However, he's just got a plentitude of fixtures in the short term, so he might be one option to really think about. However, I'm just not too high on Mbeumo, so I think it's more of a case of if you want to drop Tony for a reason, or you want to double up that way and you're kind of bored of going for double Brentford defense, then you could go towards that structure if you want to double up, but I would not sacrifice Tony in the structure. For me, Tony is actually the best asset in the forward position right now. Watkins is also a great option. However, I think Havertz is slowly surging up the radar. We saw him take the penalty in the game versus Borussia Dortmund. He did miss the first take of the penalty, was allowed to retake, then scored. Then we also got Potter's confirmation that him or Reece James will be the penalty takers for that team. Now that gives a lot of credence to Reece James being a fantastic option. despite the injury concerns, but that also just makes Havertz simply a much better option. Now that we've seen him move it to a 3-4-3 structure, you're slowly starting to see that Felix's minutes are starting to deteriorate, where he's no longer a 90-minute man in that sort of two up front formation that Chelsea were trialing for a while, but weren't getting many results from, both on the underlying point of view when it comes to attack and also simply just in the results from goals. We've all seen that XG philosophy stat of how Chelsea only scored 6 goals from an XG of 18. What I would say, though, is it's very clear Havertz is the only option that can be trusted upon to play the centre-forward spot. And with Felix, it's a different situation because he now has to compete with all the other wingers in this team. Pulisic among them. Mudryk, of course, hasn't been getting many minutes, but you know that Felix now has much less of an expected minutes edge, and he just has to fall as a result. Kane, Haaland, obviously permanent options that you'd like to think about keeping your team. However, what I would say for wildcard 27 players is you kind of have to make a decision between Haaland, Fernandes, and even Salah. One of those options is going to have to be in your team. However, 2 of them are going to be missing. So you need to think about the overall picture of your team, what that means for Game Week 29, so on and so forth. A lot of managers, I feel like, are going to go for Haaland out on Game Week 28 if they're on a non-wildcard trajectory. And of course, even if you're wildcard on Game Week 28, then it's a perfect time to go off of Haaland for just 1 week and then bring him back on Game Week 30, because you're technically only missing that Game Week 29 fixture where you would have captured Game Week 28 and someone playing there such as Watkins and also someone who has a double game week in Game Week 29. So you're really only losing Haaland for 1 fixture to actually capture 2 fixtures in between. So that's my thought on Haaland. I feel like he's worth dropping in Game Week 28, but not necessarily now. I still fancy him as a top option. And I mean, the Crystal Palace game is a great game on paper for him. And Kane, of course, has one of his best fixtures in a long while. Whereas with Darwin, the issue is simply just a blank. And then also how tough that double is in Game Week 29 comparing also the fact that you have to spend a lot of money on Darwin. So a lot of people are thinking of going for these structures where maybe even if you want to reincorporate Salah in your team, it might make more sense than actually spending that sort of money on Darwin, because Darwin probably blocks your ability to go for Kane. And that's kind of what you have to think about. Kane has the similar amount of fixtures. He's got 3 fixtures in 3 weeks, whereas it's the same with Liverpool. There's going to be a sacrifice made if you want to keep Darwin in your team, and I don't think that the sacrifice is worth it. Johnson's that last option that I really forgot about, but I feel like the benefit towards Johnson is simply that he has shown a lot of development during the year. I remember the Leicester game as one of the classic examples of how raw he was as a player and how unpolished, but over the season, as he's gone on, he's actually gotten consistent. He's made much better decisions inside the box, which is the key thing you want to see within a player who's now moving towards a step up in the league and is young and developing. I feel like he's really developed an eye for goal. We've, of course, seen the underlying stats. That has actually stayed relatively level, but I feel like the clinical finishing is now the edge you're looking at. You could argue that as form, and you could say he's probably not a tried and trusted asset. Ultimately, he just doesn't have a blank, and he plays in Game Week 29, so he's a fantastic option just alongside Solanke as well. So that's kind of how I feel about an option like Johnson. He's worth thinking about if you want to plug in a gap in your team, but just because Mbeumo and Ferguson have more fixtures, I feel like there's more upside there anyways, and that's kind of my issue with Johnson. If we move now towards the defense, there aren't too many changes here. I've dropped Ben White because he's been dropped once again. Now, of course, he did score in that game, but I don't think that really necessarily means the defender becomes essential within the team. It's clear that as we begin to think about dropping Arsenal defenders over the next few weeks, that dropping Ben White or even moving him out for another player makes a lot of sense, specifically now that he's no longer getting consistent starts in this busy period of the season. They're still involved in Europa League. You saw them have to play for Sporting. There's going to be a second leg there. If they continue to qualify, they will have to have a little bit of rotation from that aspect. And also simply other teams just have more fixtures. Plus, if you look at Game Week 30 as an example, there's a good reason to suggest maybe hopping off at Game Week 29, because some of the teams will have doublers in Game Week 29, probably a better Game Week 30 fixture. And it's a nice time, it feels like, to hop off of someone like a Ben White. However, I still think he's a great option. Dunk and Estupinian still reign as supreme though, and me, Pinnock, Henry, I really can't choose between them, so I've actually added them all here. The underlying numbers don't really suggest much between the 3 of them. Me and Pinnock, they're both plenty capable of actually scoring from a set piece, and Henry actually had a fantastic assistive chance for someone like Mbeumo in the previous match versus Fulham, but it was completely and utterly wasted by Mbeumo, so he didn't actually get any shine in that game. But I feel like if you were actually watching that game, you would have known he would have been an interesting asset. And people make a lot of mention about how he plays in a back 4 or back 5. I still think he looks like a good attacking option there, but of course, when you look at these 5 options between Brentford and Brighton, Estupiñán probably has the highest amount of upside. The underlying stats support that, with him having an extremely high expected assists per 90 stat. However, he does play a little bit less minutes than all the other players here. The concern, of course, is also the overhang between Game Week 29 when he plays in the international break versus Australia and then has to immediately play within 2 to 3 days his first fixture in Game Week 29. But I feel like the upside is there for you to actually just dissuade that argument and just say you're catching upside there with Estupiñán. As far as other options that I think are interesting, Fofana has risen for me. He's been an option that it seems like clearly Potter is very confident about. The only concern with him is whenever he gets injured, because it seems like he's very frequently catching these injuries, and that's the only concern, very similar to someone like Reece James. The upside isn't necessarily there, but he's at a very, very good price to actually capture Chelsea. We've seen Badiashile being rotated, so it just seems like Fofana is the option to think about. Meanwhile, I've actually taken Badiashile off of the cheat sheet. Emerson also drops because we're getting to see consistent Pedro Porro starts. And I'm not really sure why, because Emerson was actually in a hot bout of form, and now this Tottenham team looked to be pretty uninspiring with him actually out of the team. I wouldn't say, of course, Emerson is someone who's carrying the Tottenham team, but it's just a weird sort of decision. And the sort of dilemma right now with Tottenham seems to be a bit more about bigger things, like what's going on with Conte. So I wouldn't really think about Tottenham as a team that I'd like to back over this period outside of Kane, who's just incredibly consistent. 5.0 to 5.4, no changes for Gabriel and Zinchenko, but Shaw does rise, and Shaw rises simply because he's got a great Game Week 29 fixture. I do feel like there's an opportunity here to actually think about De Gea as your third Man United asset, and I'll talk about De Gea when I talk about the keepers, but Shaw is a slight concern in the sense that this fixture period is extremely demanding for someone like him, and he's going to play a lot of minutes and a lot of games. There might be a chance that he gets the odd rotation. Now, I don't see him really being rotated in Game Week 29 versus Newcastle and Brentford, because these are very tough fixtures ultimately, and Shaw is going to be called upon to play in those fixtures. But you could see some random rotations for him that make maybe De Gea an interesting option to think about as your third option, particularly now that Sanchez/Steele give us some concerns, and we don't have too many keepers to play around with unless you really want to go with a triple Newcastle defense. As far as the 5.5 plus options, I've added Chilwell to the top. James has also dropped, and the reason why is because I feel like Chilwell has now replaced James in terms of my interest for a Chelsea asset to own in the defensive position. Chelsea, of course, have a great run of games, but the concern with James always is going to be this knock. They're continuing to keep their place in the Champions League, and that just means that there will be potential for James to be rotated over this period if Azpilicueta can find his way back into training and being consistent in the team. There's going to be a concern about James overall and whether his minutes will be managed as he tries to recover from injury and build some serious fitness under his feet. Whereas with Chilwell, it feels like we've overcome that aspect of the season for him, and he's building in 90 minutes consistently. We also saw Cucurella play on that sort of third center-back position in the Borussia Dortmund game, which meant that we saw both Chilwell and Cucurella together, and they actually looked both really good in that system. So I feel like that benefits Chilwell a lot, because we're getting to see that the underlying stats are flying with Chilwell playing in this back three, and that's of course what you want to capitalize on when we think about Chilwell as an FPL asset. So rounding off the cheat sheet with the goalkeepers, what we have here is an introduction to Steele to the cheat sheet. He's a second tier option because I feel like he's at a fantastic price, but you need to really consider whether you want to actually go for Steele in your team. It does bear the risk of actually occupying once again that Brighton spot in your team. If you were tempted to go from Sanchez to Raya, if it was one free transfer, I would probably do it this week. But to go from Sanchez to Raya for a -4, I would not recommend, because you're losing a player in Game Week 28 and you're not really capturing any immediate upside. I feel like Steele would actually provide the same value, considering the hit is involved to going to Raya if you have, let's say, already a triple up of Brentford and a triple up of Brighton. So I think Steele's an interesting gamble. I wouldn't say necessarily that he's going to be nailed for the rest of the season, but it's very clear that De Zerbi has made a decision, and I think the goalkeeper position is always about mental aspects of the sport. So things like consistency are much more valued in the keeper position, and just in general the sort of mental mindset of the keeper. Kepa is such a good example of that, where he had years with seemingly no confidence and couldn't play a single proper game for Chelsea, and now you're actually seeing him with incredibly great shot stopping percentages, good save percentages, and it ultimately seems like Kepa is at least starting to look like he could repay the worth that he was as one of the most expensive keeper transfers of all time. So that's what I have to say here. Kepa and Raya are the supreme keepers. Pope rises because Newcastle have a boundless amount of games. And if you, let's say, don't have Botman or Burn as your second Newcastle defense, I think it's interesting to go into Pope this week. I wouldn't really recommend tripling up on Newcastle defense. I think that's an extremely boring way to play FPL. But therefore, you also have the option of De Gea that I mentioned with Shaw, where if you feel like Shaw might be rotated, or you feel like there will be some games where he plays center back, then I feel like De Gea is a good coverage of Shaw. Now, I'm not saying that Shaw is worse as an option compared to De Gea. I think he's in fact much better. We've seen the ceiling of Shaw to be something like a 15-minute or a 15-point, 12-point game compared to someone like De Gea, who's most likely going to get between 6s to 8s as his peak ceiling unless he saves a penalty. So that's kind of my thoughts right now with someone like a De Gea. He's an interesting option if it allows for a better defense for you to be played in Game Week 29 whilst avoiding Shaw and also improving in the keeper position now that we have a little bit of uncertainty with Sanchez and Steele as an example. And Ramsdale, he still stays where he is because I think I have tremendous confidence in this Arsenal team, but you could consider him on the outs, I guess, as a keeper option to think about. He's probably going closer to an orange option in my mind than anything else. And that's going to be the cheat sheet this week, so I thank you guys so much for watching the video, and I'll see you guys shortly.